The following content is provided by MIT OpenCourseware under a Creative Commons license. Additional information about our license and MIT OpenCourseware in general is available at ocw.mit.edu.
We have with us today, actually before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind everybody that next Monday, Stephen Moga and Will Stacy will be talking about photography and its role in documenting and rebuilding New Orleans. Today's speaker is Wendy Ewald. Wendy has an MIT connection. She graduated from Antioch College and then came to MIT to study photography with Minor White. It was a really wonderful program, legendary program.
It was.
And I look forward to hearing more about that, maybe not as part of this lecture, but Wendy has been, as you saw from the poster, has been working with children in her photography for most of her career, and her talk tonight is titled Secret Games, Collaborations with Children. For her work in working with children in photographing their own place and linking that to education and literacy, Wendy is a recipient of many awards for this work, including the MacArthur Fellowship. So thank you for coming this evening, and welcome, Wendy.
Thank you. I'm going to sit down. And I wish I was sitting there instead of up here, but anyway. So I thought that what might be useful is to kind of look at different phases of my work, because I have been since 1969, since I was here, working collaboratively. And at that time, that wasn't something that people did. Now it's somewhat of a fashion in the art world. But so I'm going to start with the most recent project that I'm working on right now, and it's in Margate, England. And I'm also going to read little bits of things that people have said that I've worked with to give you more of a context for the work. And this is, I'm going to read first something that Ali Reza, one of my collaborators in Margate, England, said. "In this short world of 2 days, why do you walk so proudly? Even if you become a Suleiman, in the end you will still die. I wish for the rights of all children of the world to be respected. I hope for a bright future for all children. My name is Ali Reza. I was born in Afghanistan, Ghazni. Because of problems in Afghanistan, I could not continue my life there. I really don't want to tell anything about it. There was chaos in Afghanistan. My life was in danger. I wanted to get away from all the pain I had suffered to live in a free country." So Margate is a seaside town, which is down at the hills, and it's cold. It was once a grand place, but now there are a lot of decrepit Edwardian hotels. Most of them are empty and boarded up, and but for the past, for quite a few years, the British Home Office has been housing asylum seekers in these hotels in Margate, and also it's become a place for people in Britain to start their lives over again. People who may be from Northern Ireland, or who were fleeing a situation of domestic violence, because there's all this temporary housing there. So I did a project where I worked with a number of children, both asylum seekers and British children, trying to look at the idea of asylum and the idea of starting one's life over, and to expand the traditional idea of asylum. And also I wanted to make present these people in this community who they're more than ignored. People don't really accept that they're there, There's a lot of tension. They think that asylum seekers are getting a free ride. They don't want them housed in their community. So I made portraits of each of the children I was working with, their faces with a 4x5, the backs of their heads, and the objects they brought with them. I also taught them how to use Polaroid positive-negative film to photograph their impressions of their new environment. They made maps of places they had come from and maps of their new home. And then I also made interviews with them. And you see along the side are the words that they have written. And then the first group we put along the seawall. And there were about 6 young people's suites of these photographs. And then in May, I'm going to go back and a new group of images are going to go up, but more into town. Now, one thing about doing work like this, obviously, it is very public. And unfortunately, after, while we were hanging this first set of images, the tube was bombed in London. And so the situation became more tense. And a week after we put up the images, 2 of them were petrol bombed. There was a suite of images of a girl from South Africa, and her face and the back of her head were burned, but the objects were left alone, and the objects were her flip-flops and a copy of the Principles of Islam. I also, at that point, I linked to a National Front website. And National Front is the fascist party in England, and there was lots of, all around these, there appeared fascist graffiti. So it's going to be interesting to go back now that time has passed and see what the reception of the second wave is going to be. This is a girl who came from the Congo, and she and her family have since gone underground. Their initial appeals for asylum were turned down, and they became nervous and went underground. This is a boy named Yuri from Belarus, and he chose his religious icons for me to photograph. And Yuri was a very difficult kid to work with, very emotional, very attached to me and my coworkers. It was difficult to leave in the evening without a very squeezing hug from him. And when we left, it was very sad. I worked with them for a number of weeks, and they were housed in a hotel that called the Nayland Rock Hotel, which was a place where T.S. Eliot wrote part of The Wasteland, and it was the grand old hotel in the community. It was an amazing place because there were people from all over the world there coming and going. And 6 months later, Yuri and his mother were moved. They were given an apartment in the north of England, and I went to visit him, and he was a totally transformed person. No longer was he clingy, and he was confident. He spoke English. He was going to school. He had changed his name to George, and it was an incredible transformation. Then a couple of months later, when I went back to England, I called his mother again, and I said, "How are you?" And they all have cell phones. And she said, "Well, 50-50, because her English wasn't so good." And they hadn't gotten one of their papers in on time. They had been removed from their apartment and put in a detention center, and were waiting in housed in a hotel near the airport the day that I called them. And so I arranged to meet with them the next day and at their hotel. And when I called again, I never got them again. So I can only assume that they were deported. And this is Ali Reza from Afghanistan. And he's going to school and doing fine, but not without a very difficult passage. He came out of Afghanistan by himself. He lost everybody in his family. And so initially I worked with them. They couldn't speak English, and I did interviews with them. And then by the time that I met with them again, they could speak English. So their initial interviews were translated, and then they picked passages that they wanted to place on their portraits. And this is Zakia's, and these are the ones that were burned. She's a 10-year-old girl who actually lives in the town with her family. They moved and settled in Margate. And we also, as part of the launch of the initial images, the children worked with a local artist to create installations with their photographs and their, as you can see, their suitcases. This is Zakia's, and those are her flip-flops when she was little that she brought with her from South Africa, and her doll, etc. And I initially came to, the first time I worked on this scale was in Richmond, Virginia. And I was invited by Virginia Commonwealth University and the local community that surrounds VCU to do a project. There was a series of discussions about communities in crisis. And the Carver community, which is adjacent to VCU, is a very poor community historically. While I was there, there was a dead body found in the foyer. There was lots of drug activity because 95 cut through the community. There was a fire that destroyed quite a few homes that was started at VCU. They were building a new building and didn't have the correct permits, and there was some problems with how they were building. And so it actually was one of the art buildings caught on fire, and then the fire jumped over the street that separates the community from VCU and burnt down quite a few of the homes. My project there was to create these portraits in between VCU and the Carver community, both as an homage or as to show the people in the community plus the people outside the community who actually lived in that community. And the community was very excited about having images of its young people this size on homes and on pieces of the university. This is on the home of one of the community leaders. This is on a business that is between the two communities. So this boy has chosen as an object to represent his community his mother's yearbook, and has chosen to write this on the back of his head. And this is the old Jefferson clothing store, which is right on the edge of the community. And Savante chose his grandmother's African drum to represent his community. And I love the fact that it's on this building with the bust of Jefferson. But for me, I had always worked inside in galleries, and this was a different way of collaborating with the community, not only collaborating to make the work, but also in a way that they could participate in the viewing of it, and it could change their community. These stayed up for a year and a half. The community didn't want them to be taken down, and they have them now, and they're building a community center, and they want to put them up in the community center. We were worried when we put them up that they would be written on, because there's a good bit of graffiti around, but that never happened. And sometimes people would think that the writing on that the kids did was actually graffiti, and would call up and say, hey, you better go look at those banners. So people were very protective of it. And then the community itself raised money to do a book as well. But it was a completely different community than the one in England. It was a community that's in pieces. This was, the African American community was united, had actually fought against the university to remain a residential community. So at this point, the university has to ask the community permission to move into the neighborhood. And so it's been a pretty successful partnership recently. And this is on the VCU parking lot. But I started working in Kentucky. Well, I actually started working before that, but in the early 70s. And I worked in Appalachia. And this is a self-portrait that one of my students took. And it's a picture of me with the statue behind me. So anyway, to just kind of back up a little bit, when I started working, I was really interested in how people use images and what are they for, and does that change actually what the images are. And when I had a son 10 years ago, and when he was going into kindergarten, I had to decide. We had to decide whether he was going to go into pre-kindergarten or kindergarten. I wanted him to go into pre-kindergarten, and but they asked him to make a drawing to determine whether he should, which kindergarten he should go in. And he made a kindergarten of a man with a heart and a soul, and I guess he was 3 or 4 at the time. And they hadn't seen a drawing like that of that a child that age had made. So they decided that he needed to go into the kindergarten. And then when he started out, all the rooms, and you probably have seen this, had little drawings, had little cutouts with each of the kids' names on them. Well, in his room, they had owls that were brown, and the names were written in black on these brown owls. And they were very difficult to read. And inside the classroom, the same thing. They had cubbies with these owls high up with their names written on them. And for kids who are just starting to read, it was impossible to decipher. And for kids also, I think, are very complex visual thinkers. And when people start to work with kids beyond kindergarten, they really don't think much about the visual culture of childhood. Sometimes there are art enrichment classes, but they don't approach the sophistication that kids are really capable of. And they see what's around them, they process it. I can remember my son when he was very, very little, looking at an object and then looking at a 2D representation of it and just being fascinated, you know, even before that he could talk. So really, my art has kind of grown out of certain questions that come out of that kind of thinking about that kind of representation. And since I've worked over 30 years in all different places, I've seen many different things. And so I am an artist, but my work is really intertwined with being a teacher. And so that's why I call it secret games, because really it's the kids and I are playing visual games, and I know what they're capable of. And they're not censoring themselves in the way that adults do. And also I was very interested about what are the distinctions between things. What is the distinction between child and adult and photographer and subject and documentary photography and art and in schools, you know, how is the education in our schools constructed? It's largely white, middle class, linear thinking, it's tidy, and it's sort of dedicated to doing things the right way. But although many of the students in American classrooms are neither white nor middle class. So what I was interested in was finding ways of bringing my students' world into the classroom. But the pictures I began to see were not pictures that I'd seen before of children. They are very different than quote, innocent portrayals of children who might be adorable in middle-class tableaus or victims of poverty or war. And I think that these things are sort of packaged ideas of childhood. And that's not what I was seeing. And for example, this is a photograph by Ruby Cornett, and it's a self-portrait. And it's called, "I Asked My Sister to Take a Picture of Me on Easter Morning." And this is a picture that Freddie Childers took of himself. I mean, he probably set it up and then asked his brother or sister to actually shoot it. And it's called "Self-Portrait with a Picture of My Biggest Brother Everett, who killed himself when he came back from Vietnam." And Freddie was 6 at the time. He was in 1st grade. The picture he's holding of his brother was actually when his brother was 6 as well. And Freddie went to a one-room school. It was one of 2 one-room schools still left in Kentucky at that point. And there were 8 grades, and the kids were working with Polaroid cameras, and we didn't have a darkroom at that point because there was no place in the one room. There was just a wood stove in the middle for heat. So the first thing I would do, I'll go back to this, the first thing I would do would be to ask them to make self-portraits. This is kind of, I started working there in, I think, 1975, and I was developing a way of working within schools at that point. And I discovered that if you teach writing along with photography, that teachers and schools will let you do pretty much whatever you want to do. And so it was a strategy. I was much more interested in the images. And I also thought the writing could help the students focus on what they would take. So they wouldn't, just run off home with the camera without any idea. Well, I sort of discovered that that was actually a pretty good idea, and that you could go both ways. That the kids could also write after they had the pictures, because, as you know, photography is an art of detail. And what kids have trouble with when they're learning how to write is writing from details. And also, it was a way of bringing their own homes and the things that were important to them into the classroom as subject matter. So the second thing I would ask them to do was to photograph their families, which was something they loved to do. And this photograph is called Mommy and Daddy by Martha Campbell. And these kids were, this is from not from the one-room school, it's from a small consolidated school. And these kids were taking Instamatic cameras home, which they were little cassette, it was 126 film, it was wonderful film, it was a +X film. And it had 12 shots in it. You'd put this cassette in the back of the Instamatic and close it up, and if another kid came along and opened the back, it was fine. Only the shot that was about to be exposed would be ruined. And then they brought the film back into the classroom, and I had built a darkroom, and there it was basically a box with a black plastic top on it. And they would develop and print. And I was fortunate to be able to work with these kids, some of these kids, for 5 years. So I saw them from when they were in the 4th grade through the 8th grade. And then we eventually did this book together. So also, another thing that was very important to these kids were animals. They were rural kids. The animals were pets, but they were also food. And this picture is called "My Daddy is Measuring Our Hog" by Joy Ingram. And Thanksgiving is traditionally butchering time, so this was taken in November. And one of the things that I am the oldest of 6 kids. I was around a lot of kids in Kentucky, my neighbors, and I often watched them and thought about their intense creativity when they're playing, and was wondering how I could access that photographically. So I kind of struck on the idea of asking them to photograph their dreams as kind of being a way that I could put it that they might understand. And so to start off, we went in our darkroom and turned out the light in there and told each other dreams, and there were some scary dreams, and to create an atmosphere that was comfortable for them to share their dreams with each other. And then I asked them to make images of those things. And for some kids, it was like just turning on the light. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, and for other kids, it was something that was very, very difficult. This is by Alan Shepard, and it's called "I Dreamed I Killed My Best Friend, Ricky Dixon." And Alan and Ricky had a fight over knives. They'd swapped hunting knives because all these kids had knives, and a lot of them actually had guns too for hunting. And they each thought the other one had tricked them, so they had stopped talking. And Alan had this dream about Ricky, and then asked Ricky to enact it for him. And in the making of the photograph, the two of them made up and continued their friendship. This is by Denise Dixon, who is the most talented student I've ever worked with. I don't know what has happened to her. She moved away from the mountains. And this is called "I Am Dolly Parton." And Denise's only photographs pretty much were self-portraits and photographs of her twin brothers who were younger than she was. But she did many self-portraits. This is another one called the girl with the snake around her. I am the girl with the snake around her neck. And I don't know if you guys know who Cindy Sherman is. Do you know who she is? Well, I always say that Denise did these before Cindy Sherman did her pictures. Only Denise really, they're more moving to me because Denise really believes she's those people in that moment. And this is another one of her pictures, and it's called "Philip and Jamie Are Creatures from Outer Space in Their Spaceship." And she worked very hard to create the effects that she wanted. There's nothing unintentional about any of this. And you can see if you look at her contact sheets, she experimented with a lot of different materials before she got the stockings right to get that look. And she made some very long, complicated dreams too. And we had an exhibition at the University of Kentucky. We had many exhibitions. We had one at the International Center of Photography in Chicago, but the one at University of Kentucky, we took most of the kids, and Denise's mother came as well because she was very proud of Denise's photography. And during the opening, she stood next to that picture the whole time to tell anyone who looked at it that her kids really didn't look that way. But, there's something, I knew that there was something about these pictures that I hadn't seen in other photographs before. Either photographs of Appalachia, or actually earlier I worked in Canada. They were different than documentary pictures. And it's interesting now, I'm starting to because of the internet, get back in touch with a lot of these people who are now in their 40s. And it's interesting to hear, what that kind of meant to them, or how it fit into their lives. And we're about to reprint the book, which was now 25 years ago, I guess, that we did it. And then I did lots of things, but I went to India in the early 90s. And for me, that was a very important experience because I lived in a village in Gujarat, and I worked with kids, 20 kids in that village. And those kids didn't have any pictures. Nobody in the village had any pictures. There were no newspapers with pictures. There were no books with pictures. There were no snapshots. The images that there were laminated colorful laminated pictures of the gods that were on their houses. And so when I started working, everybody wanted to be involved. And I was working with a local organization, and the elders in the village said that they thought that I should create a kind of test to see who should be in the class. And so I asked each one of the kids what they wanted to take pictures of, why they wanted to take pictures, and to look through my camera and tell me what they could see. And what I started discovering was that they all said they wanted to photograph the gods. And so I was really perplexed, and as were the people from the community who, not from the community, but from the organization who were working with me. And finally we said, okay, well, so what is a photo? And which was the word that was being used in Gujarati. And they showed us the laminated pictures of the gods. So what I had to do, which was such a privilege to be able to do, was to tell them, to show them what a camera could do. And fortunately had Polaroid positive negative film. So I took a picture of each one of them and showed them the negative and gave them the print. And I just asked each one of them to sit how they wanted to sit. So I did a whole series of pictures of them, and it was the first time they'd looked at a camera and the first time, you know, the camera had looked at them. And I was just doing it as a teaching tool. But then later on, I realized that there was a kind of power to the images because of that, you know, first intense gaze. And so I used them subsequently in a book that I did. And then I paired them with interviews I did with the kids at the end of the project. And this is Hasmukh, one of the kids, and I'll just read you a little tiny bit of I think, if I can find it, of one. Because it also, context became very important for these images. I, you know, needed to explain really who these kids were. Not that just that they were taking pictures, but who they were was as important as what they were taking pictures of. So he's 14 and a member of the farmer caste. And he says, I got married 2 months ago. It was a nice day. We all went to my wife's village on a tractor. No one danced, but people sang. I enjoyed it. I married Gali from Vasna near Dodal. My sister married a fellow from Vasna, and when we visit, I'd see Gali fetching water. I had no idea that I would marry her, but she knew. I didn't even know her name. When I got engaged, Gali's relatives came here to the village. Her father brought me a turban, a letter, and a piece of paper. Then he put a coconut in my hand and brought me a bowl of butter to drink. Her father's a rich man, so she brought lots of money and gold ornaments with her. Gali wears village skirts and saris. She's tall. Maybe I'll grow to be a tall fellow like her. But short boys get married too. She's 13 and I am 14. I like her. She's good-natured and good-looking. I took 4 or 5 pictures of her standing by the door. I'd like to bring her to photography class, but she'll feel shy. She doesn't fight with me. She always respects me, and when she doesn't, I'll send her away. Eventually, I'll go to my father-in-law's place to live. They have a scooter and 2 cycles over there. I'll need a kid also. I want only one son. No both, a son and a daughter. I'll name the boy Mahesh and the girl Wendy. I don't have any brothers and sisters at home, so I like it when she comes to stay. I have 3 sisters, but they are married. One brother died in an accident, and one drowned. He was a lame fellow. Neither of his legs worked. When he walked to the fields on crutches, he always passed a dump. One day it was filled with water, and he fell into it and drowned. I dream about my brothers that died, so at night I cover myself with a blanket to keep away the dreams. When my heart beats, the dream comes out. It shouts from the whole body, I'm coming out. and then it comes out. On Diwali, I dreamed that I went up to the sun in a balloon. I saw 2 goats standing on the edge of the sun, and they tried to butt me away. We are all dreaming, but in the morning when we open our eyes, the dreams are all gone. Last night, I dreamed I had a girl in my pocket. So the form of the book also became very important to me as a way of contextualizing the images. And there on the left you see one of the photos, and then I wrote about the experience of working together. Each of the sections was divided by prayers that were used in the process of working together, and this is a prayer which was recited at the dedication of the darkroom, because we built a darkroom. There were only mud houses, so we built a cinder block darkroom with a tin roof in the barber's front yard. The barber was one of the village elders, and he agreed to let us have that piece of land for 10 years, rent-free, if at the end of the 10 years he could have the building. And so it was a big day when the dark room was opened, and there was lots of ceremony and speeches, and this was part of it. And another thing that was quite remarkable about these kids is it was very difficult for them to photograph there, because everybody wanted their photograph to be taken. And so it was hard for them to isolate the figure or isolate something. So towards the end of the project, they spontaneously, some of the kids started cutting up the images. This is the result of one of those projects. But they used everything, every bit of the process, the paper that wrapped around the film, the box, the leader, and I got books with archival paper from Gandhi's ashram for them to work on. So it was a case of sort of following where they wanted to go. And then eventually, when I did do this book, which is called I Dreamed I Had a Girl in My Pocket, there was a section of my photographs, a section of their photographs. So it was really about this collaboration. It was about the village, but it was also about how we had worked together. And so the picture on the right is my picture. The picture on the left is Sajan's picture. And she's photographed the wedding of the girl whose face is cut off in the front, and the boy in the center of the picture. And so they, just want to say one more thing. One of the great things about working with them is that they really believed strongly that making an image was giving respect. And so every piece of the process also, they related to that. And when they developed film, when they would agitate the film, they would pray, because it reminded them of the Ardi, which is part of the prayer ceremony. And in the darkroom, we had a bulb that we painted red for our safe light, and they called that God's bulb. But it was a privilege for me to get to understand photography through their eyes, and to have to explain it from the basic viewpoint of giving respect by making an image. And then I went to Polaroid, sent me to Mexico, and to create an exhibition. And this actually I think was in '92, and I worked in 4 different communities, 2 indigenous communities and 2 Ladino or 2 communities of Spanish descent in Chiapas. And it was the year before the revolt in Chiapas. It was the first time I asked kids actually to use positive negative film. I thought it would be something that would be very difficult because with these cameras you have to measure the distance and you can't see it. And also they had to carry a bucket of sodium sulfite with them when they shot to put the negatives in. It was pretty complicated. What I found, however, is that's a great thing to do because the kids had to work hard to learn how to command the material, and they were certainly up to it, and it slowed their process down so they can think about what it was that they were going to do. This is a photograph by Juan Jesus Murillo, and it's called "Here's My Cousin Miri with the Skulls and Fruit for the Day of the Dead." I always have asked the kids to make titles for their pictures with the idea that these photographs are going to be seen by people, and that if you make any kind of verbal context for a photograph, then you can direct people to what it is that you want them to see, to further give them control over the image. And Juan Jesus is actually one of the better photographers, and he was blind in one eye and had a hard time seeing out of the other eye. And he said what he really liked about taking pictures was that when kids would talk about experiences that they'd had together, they would always say, "Oh, you remember when we saw that? Oh, you remember that guy? You remember what he looked like?" And those weren't things those weren't common memories he could have because he didn't see the same things. And so by having the photographs, he could go back and talk with his friends and also look closely and see some of the things that they were seeing. And this is by Teresa Lopez, called "My Dog Walking in the Patio." And of course, every different camera, different kind of film, affected the process, affected the photographs, but also the process of working together. This is by Nicasio Perez, and it's called "My Sister is Braiding Her Hair." And this is by Vladimir Stalin Besaril Vargas, and it's called "The Hens Are Going into the Kitchen." So here again, animals. This one is called "My Sister Carrying the Water," and it's by Luis Hernandez Gomez. And for a lot of these kids, they didn't have any photographs, had never had any photographs. This is one of my favorite photographs of all times, I think. And it's by Sebastian Gomez Hernandez, and it's called "The Devil is Spying on the Girls." And I have no idea how he was able to make that, how the kid got it, because I wasn't there, when these were made, how the kid got up there. But in Mayan culture, dreams are extremely important. Whatever happens in a dream is considered as real as waking reality. So when I let them know that we would be, I would be asking them to photograph dreams, they were very excited. And all I had to say is fantasias. And the next day they arrived with masks that they had made, and this is one of the masks. They didn't have any materials, so the masks were made from the back of cracker boxes, and they're beautiful masks. And but I said, well, why did you make the horns coming out of the jaw? Why didn't they come out of the top of the head? And he said, oh, I don't know, it just looked good to me that way. And then later, I was actually sharing a house with an anthropologist, and she pointed out to me images in the Mayan glyphs where these things of that shape come out of the jaws. And then I began to think about, well, where do these ideas come from? They are embedded in the visual ideas are embedded in the culture, and anything that a child comes up with is for a reason. This is called Wolfman and His Enemy by Javier Bautista. And these kids went to great lengths to make their dream photographs realistic. And they're also using a very difficult process where they're measuring the distance and they got to hold it steady. And this is called Sebastián Was Punished for 8 Hours by Dominga González Castellanos. And she could have gotten the point across by putting a couple of runs of rope around him, but that's not what she wanted to do. And usually when kids see this, they won't believe that it's not real. So I did many other things, but another experience which was very important to me was working in Saudi Arabia, which I did in 1997. At a certain point, I became very interested in how people see photographic images in different cultures and different countries in the world. So I was sort of trying to go to as many different kinds of places. And I was very interested in working in the Muslim world. And I worked in Morocco for, I guess, in 1995. It was a wonderful experience, but it was quite difficult. I made some mistakes. I asked the kids to photograph their families, first of all, because I thought that would be where they would be most comfortable, and they let me know later that that was not what I should have done. What they said they wanted to photograph were monuments, and I didn't understand what they meant by monuments, and I thought, oh, that's a very un-kid-like idea. It's a received idea from the culture, and they need to loosen up and be more playful. Those are my stereotypical ideas. And in fact, that's probably what they should have done to begin with. I also asked them to photograph in their community. And everyone assured me that was fine, that there would be no problems, they could do it. And the photographs came back all blurry, and I couldn't figure out why, because I knew that they were very, skillful. And in fact, there had been a catastrophe out on the street, and people were yelling at them, throwing rocks at them. They were trying to trick people. They were up for it. They were very, that didn't bother them. But I felt horrible. And so I finally got the translator that I was working with for all of us to have a discussion which I could tape, so that I could actually get it translated word by word, so that I would know exactly what was going on, so people weren't trying to be nice to me and saying that there was no problem. One of the people I met when I was in Morocco was the cultural attaché, because in order to do all this work, I had to bring cameras and film and everything through customs. I don't know that I could do it anymore, really. So I would get the diplomatic pouch somehow or another. And so the woman who was in Morocco, who helped me out, was then stationed in Saudi Arabia, and wrote me and said, well, you know, would you come work with women and girls? And so I said, sure. And it was very difficult to get a visa. I was going with my husband and my son, and they weren't happy about that I was the primary worker. And also the fact that women were going to make photographs was problematic. There is a house, something called the House of Photography, though, in Saudi Arabia, and there's a men's group and a women's group. And so the women's group asked to have a woman photographer come and work with them. So I decided to ask them to make self-portraits and photograph their dreams, because it was something that they could do within their families. They wouldn't have to go out. This is one of those self-portraits. In order to show them publicly, of course, they couldn't have their faces in them. So she's used the chair to obscure her face. And it's a series called Who Am I, 1970 to 1997. So I think there were about a dozen images. And she's looking at different books which represent different parts and stages in her life, and then has placed different objects next to her. And these were all taken with Instamatics, with point and shoots. Kodak had donated the film and processing. They were interested in creating a market in Saudi Arabia, so I had to meet with the Kodak executives while I was there. So I also wanted to photograph them, and this is one of the pictures that I made. And we negotiated quite early on how to make these pictures so that they could be published. It was very important that they be published. This is also Nadine, but this is how Nadine wanted me to photograph her, by photographing her daughter. And I suggested she add her hands. And I had started, actually in India, giving the black and white large format negatives to the people who were in them to alter in any way that they wanted to do it, to sort of lay there, even if I made an image, that they laid claim to that image by putting their own marks on the negative. So this is what she wrote, and I don't know what the Arabic is, but the English says, "When I were a lady." And one of the women that I was fortunate to work with was a writer named Raja Alem, who's continued to be a great friend and correspondent. And she's actually a well-known writer in the Arab world. This is a picture of her holding the Book of Dreams. And then she wrote on her abaya all around. I don't know if I have what she wrote. But when these were first published, I asked her to write a piece to accompany them. And I'll just read you a little bit of it. In this case, photography turned out to be something more. It began when we allowed an outsider to see behind the veil. Then, assuming the role of hunters put us in another realm and gave us a place to stand that was powerful enough to alter the male-controlled orbits we move in. When we took our cameras into the street, people reacted with sincerity and entertained new possibilities. The bodies they had lived in so long opened to whatever experiences they might encounter. They seemed oblivious to the dangers of intrusion or captivity. They opened up and posed happily, smiling at the camera's charm and at our courage in openly pursuing stories in circumstances that are ordinarily closed. By posing, they allowed us to steal their souls, and in the very act of announcing our power, we women gained power over the men. And this is a picture that Raja took of herself. And it was great working with these women. They had never, I think there was one woman who was a photographer, but everyone else had never taken pictures, you know, including Raja. And I worked with them in really very similar ways to how I worked with children. This is another one of her pictures, and it's called Twin Sisters. So they had to find symbols in a lot of ways to represent themselves, which was very interesting. This is her actual sister, Shadia, who's a painter. And it says, I used to dream my paintings before, but now they dream me, I think. And Shadia came to me to be photographed with drawings that she had put on her face. And then when I gave her the negative, then she added this second layer of drawings. These look, as silver prints, they're, you know, like 50 inches by 60 inches, and they're pretty incredible, and they have this sort of depth to them because of the different layers of markings. And we decided to have an exhibition pretty early on. I only could get a visa to be there for 2 weeks, so we did everything in 2 weeks. But we decided to have an exhibition in Saudi Arabia. There had never been any photographs shown before by women. And so we had to decide who it was going to be for. Because if it was going to be for just women, then they could use any of the pictures they had. But they decided they wanted it to be for a complete audience. And so then we had to begin the process of deciding what we could use and what we couldn't use. And that was actually pretty painful. Well, probably more for me because I wasn't used to it. And also for some of the younger girls who were told that they couldn't use certain pictures. For example, this didn't get used, but this one did. And this is by one of the, I took it, of Joanna holding her little sister. And her little sister is younger than 7 or 8, which is about the time when their faces start having to be covered. And but Joanna put that beautiful veil marking all on her and everything except for her little sister. But when it came time to publish it, she asked me to add more lines to her face to further protect her face. And it was actually very difficult for me to do, but I did it. And this is by the one photographer in the group, Noah Khalib, and it's called "Sleeping with My Shoes," and it's a dream image. So the first night there were 3 openings, and I actually wasn't there, but they all called me from the opening. The first night was for women. The second night was for men, and the third night was for families. And they did a catalog, and one of the princesses sponsored it. And this is called "Crying for My Face," also by Noha, which I think symbolically is such a wonderful image. And just, I'll go quickly through some of these later things. When I started working on specific issues, and this was at a time when in Durham, North Carolina, where I've worked a lot, when two school systems were merging, and African American kids and white kids were going to be going to school for the first time, and there was a lot of trepidation. So I designed a project that I thought would be educationally interesting plus conceptually. And so I asked them to write about themselves write a self-portrait, and then write another one as if they were a member of the other race. And so this is a kid, Damian Barnett, who's African American, and he's written, I'm light-skinned and have black hair, etc., as himself. And then as white Brent, he says, I am 11 years old, I'm the only child, my name is Brent, I go swimming, etc. And then I asked them to bring things from home so that they could pose as each of their selves. So on the left, he is a white only child, and on the right, he's himself. And this is Antonio Gunter, who's imagined himself as white, as being homeless. And when I was able to talk to him about it, after we made the pictures, he said that he imagined being white was to not have a community in the way that he had a community as an African American. And this is Heather, who's imagining herself as jumping rope as an African American, and reading as a white girl. And all of the reading photographs were white, whether they were by African Americans or whether they were by whites in the beginning when I started doing this. And then after the merger, things changed, because this was done for many years. Other people did it as well as I did it. And this is an African American boy, Gregory Blake, imagining to be white is to be aggressive. So he added all those lines, all those beautiful lines. He posed, I took the picture, and then and this is Xavier Vereen. And I'll just read you, this is really short. He says about himself, I am silly, have dark brown hair, I'm scared of snakes, I like dancing and singing. 5, I like to swim. 6, I like track and field. 7, I like to talk on the phone. 8, I like to play with my dog. 9, my favorite team is North Carolina. 10, my favorite food is pizza. If I was white, 1, I will change my name to Jonathan on Family Matters. 2, people will call me a saltine. 3, I will be a rock star on stage. 4, I will stay in school. 5, going to funerals will be different. And 6, I would like going to Greek restaurants. And that's Brandy Bishop imagining she's a white girl, imagining she's an African American princess with her castle behind her. And this is finally when things began to change after a couple of years of merger. And now this is a project that at University of North Carolina is a big teacher training program, and the teaching fellows do this project before they get their certification. And then lastly, the last book I did is called American Alphabets, and it's looking at what America is through language. And it includes 4 different alphabets: Arabic, Spanish, English, white girls, and English, African American middle school students. And the white girls were done at Andover, and they chose the words, and I made the pictures with Polaroid and them directing me, and then they chose the color backgrounds and wrote the letters and the words. And then also they're included, they wrote definitions, their own definitions for the words and sentences using the words. And this is the Arabic alphabet, which I did on silk, that you can digitally on silk that you can see through, and it's at this is an installation at the Queen's Museum, and I worked with middle school students in Queens. And this is the word amar, which means to command. And this is the word neighbor, Jim. And this was, the installation opened right before the Iraqi war started. And we had Arab Family Day, and it was a wonderful day. Lots of people from the community and the parents were there, and they all talked underneath the banners about what it meant to them to see their language monumentalized in that way, and respected in that way. And this is Shem, or smell. And they had to figure out how to use, these markers are also on the negative, so they had to figure out how to use, a yellow marker to, create blue, etc. So it's quite complicated. This is diminish, which I thought was a great one. And this is kitab, or book. And this is the first time these kids had never been together as a group before, and it was something they were very pleased about. And this is the school lunch. Sorry, it's backwards. And that's it. Those slides. So, any questions? I'd be happy to answer.
I have a question. I was curious back to the beginning where you were showing the photographs in Margate and near the Virginia Commonwealth University on buildings and walls and as part of a neighborhood, a place. Mm-hmm. And the question that rose in my mind was who selected the sites for these different photographs to be put up?
Yeah, well, in Richmond, it was a combination. I talked to the kids about where they wanted them, and one of the big sites they really wanted was Kroger's, because there was a new Kroger's, and also VCU, and we did those. But there were also other sites that we did use, and there were people in the community that wanted them on their houses. So the one you saw in the house, there were two community leaders that definitely wanted them on their houses, two older women, and we used those. And then there were some other, then we got into the idea of like, where was this walk going to go? And so we identified some other buildings that it would make sense, to use. But I think the core of them, the majority of them, were ones that people wanted. And then there were like three different, maybe businesses, 3 or 4 businesses that we asked if we could.
And who did those negotiations?
Oh,
Were you involved with that?
No, it was the leaders of the community group and the contemporary art space that I was working with who did that. Yeah, I wish that the kids had been more involved in that because they were in school. Also, it was difficult to do that, and even when they went up, they weren't there when they went up. so I made sure that in Margate they were there when they went up, and also we went around and they, said where they wanted things, and that was much better. But when I was doing it in Richmond, I really sort of didn't know what I was doing or how it was going to go, and it was quite scary actually, doing it the first time. And I was worried about the kids. How were the kids going to feel? Not having them there with me was difficult. But in fact, they all loved it, and they brought their families there, and it was. And then they also began to get nicknames based on their building. So there's one of the girls was called Kroger. But there was a really difficult moment in the beginning, because the first site we put up, one of the girls had written, my grandma likes African stuff. And I think there was an African mask that she used. And someone, as soon as we put it up, someone first of all thought that they were ads, which I sort of was interested in, that idea, that they did sort of look almost like ads, or you could think that, but they weren't. And then when this person found out, well, no, that it wasn't an ad, but that it actually came from the community, he was incensed over the word stuff, that it was disrespectful. And that sort of, he led a sort of campaign about this, and then there was another image where a girl had written about her community, and she had written it as a poem, but it was in dialect, I guess. And so then he seized upon that and how that was disrespectful, and he threatened the school, and the principal said, deal with it. And so the community leaders got different factions together, including him and people from the school, and they held a prayer meeting to pray for the success of the meeting, and then we talked with him. And it was really difficult. And then finally I said, well, have you ever read Toni Morrison? You know how she writes and how she uses language. And that helped him understand that it was all right for a child to write, use their own self-expression in that way. But that was the one problem that we...
It's interesting because those are such intimate portraits in such public places.
I know. I was terrified. I was really, I hadn't understood. I mean, I understood it, but when you are involved in something, you see it. I mean, I was by myself when they were sort of coming down, but yeah.
Did you have an exhibition in Mexico and in India? And if so, can you talk more about the community reaction, as well as Saudi Arabia? The Men's Day versus the women's versus the families. Can you talk about what the community response was? Yeah. In India, it was we had one in the school, which was two rooms, but there was nothing in the rooms. There was a dirt floor, and so I strung clotheslines up, and we got some cardboard, and the kids pasted their pictures on the cardboard, and then they wrote titles on them, and then we used clothespins and hung them from the clothespins, and it was a huge thing. People came from villages around. People wore ceremonial dress. I had to wear a sari. I mean, I wish all my openings were like that. I thought they were going to break down the door before we got it up. It was so much excitement, and officials gave speeches. It was a big thing. In Mexico, we did have one in the town. In Mexico, it was more problematic because Polaroid in Mexico
was unhappy about the fact that I worked in Chiapas with indigenous people. And although they loved the pictures, and they didn't want them to be shown in Mexico because they didn't want to be associated. So anyway, so there was actually, it was an exhibition that went to many places in this country, and it's been shown in the community, but it's never been shown in a museum in Mexico, which I think is a shame. But that's not Polaroid's fault here. It was also during a time when Mexico had given Polaroid a huge order to make the machines to clean up the voting registration. So it was, politically they thought that they were doing something nice for Mexico by sending me there, and then I did something that was, politically incorrect as far as they were concerned. But I do always have, exhibitions in the community. But that one in India, I think, was my favorite.
In your Durham project, photography and literacy, have you seen any impact, given that you've been there over the years, have you seen any impact on the place itself through the photography?
Well, I think, that's something that would be great if somebody actually looked into, because it has been like at least 15 years. And we have an archive, for example, I guess actually since 1989, we have an archive of children's work, every year. There are some of the schools that we've worked in who've actually centered their pedagogy around the idea of making pictures and bringing the home lives into the classroom. But, no one's ever kind of studied it. But it is, a lot of kids have had experience in different grade levels. Yeah.
You said you recently got in touch with some of the students that you photographed. I don't remember where it was from.
In Kentucky, yeah.
What are they? Have any of them pursued photography?
No. No, I've never found anybody who has, which makes complete sense to me. I mean, it's never been something I've been that interested in. I mean, I just think it's photography is this great medium that you don't need hand-eye coordination that you do for drawing or music, and so kids can really learn it quickly and use it to its full potential. But people have been getting actually in touch with me, and there have been a series of meetings actually, which is great timing for me because I really want to see what they're doing and write another piece when we reprint this book. But one of the people is now a high school principal, and she was interviewed recently. I mean, I've emailed her, but she's emailed me. But she uses photography in her teaching, she says that doing the work that we did sort of allowed her to think that she could go beyond what she thought was going to be the life for her. Because actually, when I stopped working with the kids, it took me 5 years to find a publisher to publish this first book. But I was very discouraged when I stopped working with them because I thought that as soon as they hit puberty, this sort of potential that they'd had as photographers, as creative beings was over. Because for a lot of them, like Denise, she really stopped taking pictures when she got in 8th grade, and it was really difficult for me, and she knew it was difficult for me, and so it was embarrassing. And but in fact, I found out that through contact later that actually these kids didn't do what I had anticipated, which would be that the girls would have been housewives and the guys would have been coal miners, that their lives were a lot more varied, and quite a few of them went to university. One of them went to graduate school at UNC, and so it was interesting to see. And I'm hoping actually to go back this summer when they have another one of these meetings where they bring together the people who are now, you know, in their 40s. I can't imagine it. And I think my 10-year-old son has agreed to film it. So it should be interesting. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. What you mentioned about somebody mistaking a photograph for an advertisement or something. What would you think of putting these up in extremely sort of urban metropolitan environments which are proliferated, you know?
All the images?
Right?
Yeah.
And then it's so easy because of so many sort of things like them being black and white, also because of advertising photography apprehending these things like Benetton.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is this blur of whether you can recognize something as coming from a photography community or from real experience as opposed to something that is just, you know, taken up by another form.
Right.
Just used for purely aesthetic purposes. But what are your thoughts on, because what then happens is that it kind of diminishes the possibility of downtown city centers as being these museum spaces.
I think it's great to do that. I mean, that's really why I wanted to do that. That's why I made them in black and white, so that they would be different. And I think, and I also wanted them to look a little bit like ads, so that you sort of, you know, you looked at them and then you had to look again. I think that would be fine. I think it depends on how you make the images. I mean, something like these are very simple, so they're not actually what ads look like. And the technology, well, if you get up close to these, you can see all the pores in the skin, you know, because they're shot with 4x5, and so that they actually look like you're looking at somebody. They don't look like an ad. And I think it would be very interesting.
Do you have any sort of
What?
plans of getting them to something say London India?
Yeah. No, I'd love to do that. No, I don't have any plans at the moment. Somebody has to pay for it.
Right, no, that's the other difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, my other question was, you talked about how when they reach puberty, kind of there's a lapse. Which raises the question, obviously cognitive scientists look at it, but you're working with children, you consistently have been, about the nature of creativity. I mean, how much of this is innocent thought, something that every human being possesses, and then there is something that transitions into adulthood and makes an artist. I mean, just put it very simply. Is it possible to sense it in children?
Well, I mean,
Such that can you tell this will not lapse at puberty?
No, but I don't know. I mean, we're used to thinking about this in music, right? But we're not used to it. I mean, maybe Picasso. You know, if you see Picasso's early drawings, and you know, they are incredible.
Yeah, but particularly with photography, because
Yes, because you can do it. Anybody can do it. Yeah. Well, I mean, something I would love to find Denise someday and to see what's the last thing I knew that she became a nurse practitioner. But the thing is, with her, I could tell from the first roll of film that she had a distinctive sense of composition, and it was consistent. You know, for 4 years anyway, until she stopped. And there were other kids that was true for as well. And I think that the reason why she stopped was because there was nothing in her culture that would lead her to think that she should become a photographer. You know, I don't know if there was, whether she would have become one, but I don't know what the theories are on child prodigies. But the one child prodigy that there is documented in photography is Lartigue, who started when he was 7, I think, and it was, you know, very early on in photography, so it was actually quite, you know, difficult to use the camera, etc. But he, as a child, he was a great photographer, and probably maybe till he was around 20 or 23, and he I don't think he's still alive anymore, but he continued to be a photographer and a painter, but he was never as good as he was when he was a child. And he was great as a child.
I think we'll end there on that wonderful note. Thank you so much.
Thanks.